Get ready. Get ready. Get ready. Get ready.
Hello. Welcome to episode 6 of Complexity Matters. Today we have again a special guest, and I am going to immediately introduce him. Here's Gerald Rector. Hi, Gerald. Great of you to join us here on the stream to talk about your research.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, sure. So maybe we can start out. Usually, I start out with some news, but we'll do that in a moment. Maybe it's a good start to introduce yourself a little bit. So maybe you can tell us something about your background and how you got into complexity research.
Yeah. Okay. So my background was originally in exercise physiology. I started off really trying to understand how you can use exercise in order to improve health. Somewhere along the way, the road got a little bit twisty, and I wound up, for the most part, having the common thread through all of the different domains that I worked in, have the common thread of healthy aging, right? So first I started in exercise, and then I got hooked on to immunosenescence, so the aging of the immune system, and how exercise might affect those processes as a kind of intervention or some way to kind of counteract it. Then later on, there was a very interesting analogy drawn between physical exercise and psychological stress, so acute stressors. So I got into the kind of psychoneuroimmunology domain. And all the while looking at how this affects the aging of the immune system. And so this started to build over time. And I went into general gerontology, looking at more positive factors, because the immunosenescence aspect was more related to a virus, a common herpes virus called cytomegalovirus. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but basically accelerates the aging process. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've heard of it.
Yeah. So I did a lot of work on that in regards to how things can go wrong, but then took the opportunity to look at actually more positive factors. So I went into a lot of positive psychology and more gerontology overall in my first postdoc. And then as I got around the end of my first postdoc, I realized that I've gone through a lot of different areas, a lot of different subjects, and didn't really have a way to kind of link all of them together. Of course, the healthy aging thread was there the entire time, but I was looking for a way to kind of tie all these different aspects and domains together. And so when I saw the opportunity to come to Radboud UMC in the Netherlands, I jumped at the opportunity to use complexity as a way to kind of tie these kind of seemingly different areas together in a meaningful way. And so I've been working mostly with time series data, so physiological signals that are captured by wearable sensors, and been applying complexity methods related to time series analysis to these in order to say something about resilience, which I'll get into, I think, in the presentation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so maybe it's interesting to briefly mention that, because I think many people, when you talk about something like the immune system, or in general in medical science, of course, the human body, people immediately think, well, of course they're doing complexity, but is that actually the case, or?
Yeah, so I think it's an inherently complex situation. So I mean, I think you can look at complexity from many different ways, of course. So there's a lot of tools and techniques and concepts and all these types of things that fall under the umbrella of complexity. But yeah, I think there's a difference between looking at complexity in for example, medical decision making, right? Which treatment and how that affects the body and these types of things. And that's more on a higher level. Even at the hospital level, you can say who gets what treatment and in what capacity, these types of things. So that's another level of organizational complexity. And then you have more physiological complexity of things like subsystems interacting with one another on a moment by moment basis. And that's another kind of level of complexity that you can also talk about, all within the kind of health and medical domain. So yes, I think to answer your question, you are dealing with the complexity implicitly, right? And a lot of this goes on in the physician's head, in the nurse's head, like, kind of as an internal process. They don't think of it in that way, but that's basically what's happening, right?
Yeah. So let's see. Yeah, we have some people already watching in the chat. Hello, chat. Maybe it's a good idea to start your presentation. So this will be specifically on. If I looked at your paper, of course. You were using specifically one measure, like the multiscale entropy measure, right? Or is it more a more broad?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So okay. Well, let me add your slides to the stream, and let me remove myself, and then you have the floor.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Fred. Once again, thank you for letting me inviting me to the show. Today I wanted to give a bit of a sort of high-level overview of our recently published article on dynamic resilience indicators in geriatric patients. I'll keep it relatively high level, and then we can talk about more of the details a little bit later, I suppose. But I'll start with the bigger picture and where this research kind of fits in. I think the background for this paper is particularly interesting, and it kind of gives some insight into how all of these things can be used in medicine. So I'll start with the bigger picture, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the observations that we made that really made us pause and think about our underlying assumptions and how they impact the use of these indicators in medicine. Basically, these are some of the lessons that we learned. But before I dive in, I suppose I would like to give credit to my co-authors and their invaluable contributions to this work. Of course, you can see them listed here, and obviously the participants of the study and everybody who helped along the way. Can't thank them enough, but we'll move forward. That being said, we can zoom out to this kind of bigger picture that I mentioned. So it's well known that the population is aging. Estimates suggest that the global population of adults age 60 years or older will more than double by 2050. And those above 70 and 80 will form a progressively larger proportion of that number. This ultimately means that individuals in need of medical care are simultaneously becoming older, frailer, and more likely to have multiple diseases, that complexity that we were just talking about. Even with detailed prognostic assessments and even following clinical intuitions, medicine is largely unable to objectively assess who will resist and recover from these health stressors imposed by the disease or even by the treatment itself, because that is also in some form a stressor. So speaking of bouncing back and resilience, a situation can play out as follows. An older adult encounters a stressor that's too great for them to overcome on their own. Perhaps this is a fall or an infection. Naturally, they go to the hospital where they can take one of several different paths, right? So if we say here that this thick red arrow is indicating the stressor, then the thin blue line here on the right-hand side indicates a typical path that of an initial decline in function with the gradual recovery back to the original functional level over time, right? However, there are other trajectories that are depicted here where there is diminished initial resistance. As you can see here, they go lower in their actual functionality, or there's either delayed or incomplete recovery, or even there's no recovery, as indicated, for example, in this purple trajectory where they pass this line of to either death or some other critical transition. Basically, in this study, we focused on the concept of physical resilience to try and somehow tell which path the patient was most likely to take. This might have implications in allocating resources or improving healthcare, or just making sure that that we are able to identify individuals who might need additional assistance in order to recover. Here we consider physical resilience to be the dynamic ability of a system to resist or recover from health perturbations, right? This is a definition developed by Heather Whitson, a pioneer in the resilience in geriatric patients' work. Since resilience is a dynamic process, you usually have to artificially stress the person, for example, with a sit-to-stand challenge, to see how resilient their blood pressure recovery is. There's been a lot of work showing that incomplete or delayed recovery in blood pressure is actually associated with mortality. And these are really direct ways to test the resilience of the individual by challenging them and seeing what happens, basically. However, this type of testing isn't always feasible or ethical in older adults. We had some experience where we tried to do sit-to-stand challenges in older adults, and some of them just weren't able to actually complete it. Just couldn't do it, right? So we had to think a little bit outside of the box in order to be able to say something about physical resilience, but not necessarily stress the system to the breaking point or past some unethical threshold. So this paper investigated indicators from two complex system-based paradigms that may help us get around this a little bit. Those are critical slowing down and loss of complexity. I'll briefly describe each one of those in just a moment, but the basic idea is that fluctuations in physiological signals that can be captured by wearable sensors can be used to extract certain generic dynamic indicators that are in turn associated with resilient responses to health challenges. Interestingly, these two paradigms are derived from different theoretical approaches. I mean, that's in other words, they look at the older adult from different perspectives. And this was interesting because we weren't really sure if they provided unique or overlapping information about resilience, or if they were complementary to one another, or even if and how they were related. And so this is something that we initially started out looking at the larger picture that I just showed you with, trying to say, okay, what do these trajectories look like, and how can we use these indicators to predict them potentially, to a more fundamental question where we're looking at how these actual paradigms relate to one another and how they might be used in order to say something about resilience and recovery in older adults. So going into a little bit more detail in each one of these different paradigms and the indicators that we used from each. First, we considered 3 indicators from critical slowing down. These have been dubbed the dynamic indicators of resilience, or DORs. This is work that has been largely spearheaded by Martin Schaefer at Wageningen University. And then also there's been a lot of work done at the Radboud UMC by a recent PhD student, Sana Geisel. You can see lots of her publications already. But briefly, the idea here is that the system loses resilience. Then there's kind of telltale signs. And those are larger fluctuations in the physiological output, slower recovery to equilibrium, and more rigid coupling between these different subsystems within in the larger system. And these are characteristics that have been found across a wide range of complex systems, from ecosystems to financial markets, to all kinds of different naturally occurring complex systems. And they are found to be generic indicators or telltale signs of proximity to a so-called tipping point, or where there's a increased likelihood that there's going to be a critical transition into another alternative stable state. And this is also indicative in the case of the older adult that there's potentially diminished capacity to respond to future stressors. And these telltale signs are reflected statistically in increased variance, higher temporal autocorrelation, and higher cross correlation between these subsystems. So those are the three indicators that we use from the critical slowing down paradigm. The second theoretical approach proposes that loss of complexity in physiological signals may be indicative of poor responses to stressors. So you have the situation where it's well known that healthy functioning depends largely upon the interaction of many kind of control mechanisms that are kind of pushing and pulling on one another in order to adapt to different changes encountered in daily life, right? And the idea here, as you can see on the left-hand side, as you have a youthful system, there's lots of complex interactions that are giving rise to this kind of complex output signal. So this could be something like heart rate or any other number of physiological parameters. And it makes the system more adaptable to be able to fluctuate at different time scales and across different spatial scales sometimes of how the actual older person adapts to these different challenges. And loss of complexity says that as the person ages, and in the case of progressive disease, there's a decrease in these different interactions. So you see, as you move to the right on this schematic here, that those interactions become less and less, and then that gives rise to less and less complex physiological output. And that decrease in complexity corresponds to a lower functional level or lower adaptability in this case. And it is possible to quantify this level of complexity in the signal with, as you mentioned previously, Fred, the multiscale entropy. So very briefly, we can go into more detail on this, but I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of overview of what multiscale entropy entails, so you can have a better understanding of the results themselves. If you were to calculate the sample entropy, which is on the vertical axis. This is a measure briefly of how some uncertainty or the amount of surprise that's in the time series here. If you were to do that for white noise, you get a value here, whereas if you were to have this, measure the entropy, sample entropy of 1/f noise, which is considered to be physiologically complex and adaptive and healthy, then you would see something like this. However, if you were to zoom out across multiple timescales, zoom out, zoom out, zoom out, zoom out, and look at a minute, and then look at an hour and a day, and these types of things like that, then you would see that the actual, and calculate the sample entropy at each one of those different scale factors, you would see something like this, whereby the 1/f noise would have more of a horizontal slope, whereas the white noise would have a lot of information or uncertainty at the lower end of the scale. But as you go to larger and larger timescales, it would lose that information content as you move to larger timescales. So in this case, the blue line here would represent something that maintains information or uncertainty even as you zoom further and further out. Whereas a more negative slope in this case would say something about a more negative or lower amount of information or complexity in the signal. In this study, one scale was equal to 4 seconds. So we had a range basically from 4 seconds all the way up to about 40 seconds, because we had 10 scales factors used in this particular study. So just to give a quick summary of the indicators, we had critical slowing down, which represents stability around an equilibrium. And we said that increased variance, temporal autocorrelation, and cross correlation, according to this paradigm, were indicative of reduced resilience or potentially lower resilience. A bit of a contrast in this case is the loss complexity, where it talks about ability via complex output, and that increases in the multiscale entropy slope were indicative of lower resilience. So what we wanted to do is to test out these indicators in a sample of geriatric patients. So we turned to the WellBeing and Resilience study, which was composed of older adults admitted to the Radboud UMC. These are some of the pre-admission characteristics. I won't go into a lot of detail, but they were about 84 years old on average and about 60% females. And what we did is we gave them what's called a health patch, MD, by VitalConnect. It's a chest-worn sensor, so it's like kind of like a sticker. It puts it on their chest, and it picks up a lot of different physiological signals, like ECG for heart rate, and there's also an accelerometer. We focused on, in this study, initially the heart rate and physical activity measurements. And what we did is we had a few proxies for resilience that we wanted to start off with, right? So we wanted to go in the long term to look at these trajectories. How does the actual older adult go across these individual trajectories that I mentioned before? But just to start, we wanted to look at some kind of construct validity, if you will, to see, okay, do these indicators actually differentiate out people that we would assume to be vulnerable to future health challenges based on things like how many chronic conditions they had, how frail they were, and how able they were to complete their activities of daily living. And so we use these three different indicators here as kind of health functioning measures in order to serve as proxies for resilience. I won't go into all of the details of the results, but I did pull out a few of the kind of important outcomes that we found that really kind of made us think about what we were looking at and how we were using these different paradigms. So what we found is that increased physical activity, just on average, increased variance in physical activity, and also the increased complexity in activity in these rows here were associated with lower frailty and improved activities of daily living. So that's, hopefully like what we were looking for, but only partially. If you look at the Diors, the ones where we had the increased variance and the increased temporal correlation, these two, according to the actual theory or the kind of hypothesized direction, were opposite to what we expected, right? So increased variance was associated with closer proximity to a tipping point. And so this made us kind of think and say, okay, so I mean, intuitively, this makes sense, right? So increased physical activity variance would make sense in terms of more activity and more variable activity during hospitalization, which is a clear indicator of resilience. But what does that mean in terms of relating it back to the critical slowing down theory? So one thing that we actually learned while doing this, there were several that are listed in the paper, and we can talk about those, I guess, a little bit later. But one of the things is, that came out of this was the clear distinction between regulated variables and effector type variables. And regulated variables are those variables that, those physiological variables that need to be kept at a close to an equilibrium. These are things like blood pressure, core temperature, which needs to be relatively stable, and oxygen saturation. Whereas effective variables are things that actually work best when they're allowed to vary quite widely sometimes in order to adapt to the kind of exigencies of actually daily life, right? So you have fluctuations in heart rate just from standing up from a chair, or respiratory rate, these types of things. And what Faucion found in this paper linked below or mentioned below is that that if you look at the distinction between these two, you can start to unravel these distinctions that you see in these variabilities that are sometimes good and then sometimes bad. So for example, heart rate variability is a good thing, whereas blood pressure variability is not so much of a good thing. And you start to see that as a person loses resilience, that for regulated variables, the distribution of normally the fluctuations that are normally kept within a relatively tight range start to expand and spread out. and that you have more variability that is shown within the regulated variables. Conversely, you have the opposite effect with effective variables. Normally, these effective variables will have a lot more fluctuations, and as the person starts to lose resilience, the fluctuations become more rigid or more constrained. So we found that the critical slowing down paradigm, representing this kind of stability around an equilibrium, best describe the regulated variables in this case, or loss of resilience in these regulated type of variables. Whereas on the other hand, the loss of complexity was probably more better suited for looking at adaptability via complex output, and therefore saying something about the resilience of effective type variables. And so this is one of the different things that we talked about. I mean, there's some more clinical related aspects that we go into in the paper, but this is just something that made us kind of step back and say, okay, how are these underlying assumptions in these different paradigms that we're using related to the actual situation that we have in terms of using this to say something about resilience. And if you noticed in the paper that we only used heart rate and physical activity. And that means that we did not take into account regulated variables, and therefore should say something about why we found the associations that we found. Like there were clearly some associations with the loss complexity in the physical activity, but there's also other types of variables that we can look at and see if they are better suited in order to say something about resilience. All of this is obviously still ongoing, and we're still trying to investigate. For example, in future studies, we're going to try to include these regulated variables, and we have some data that we can use using that. But for future work, what we want to try to do is to see if there's an overarching framework that can incorporate both types of variables, both the effector and regulated variables in this. So some suggestions by Faucion, for example, is network physiology, where you can look at these kind of pairwise associations between multiple multivariate signals in order to say something about the overall functioning, and using a statistic called the time delay stability. That's one way to look at it. There's also other ways that we can look at it, which is also a coherence pyramid, which is developed by Zhang et al. And yeah, I can talk a little bit more about that in detail later. But yeah, and then we have the clinical classification of resilience. Since resilience is a inherently dynamic process, we initially started off trying to look at those trajectories, like we talked about, right? So that was the envisioned goal. However, as we started going along with this, we saw that there was these kind of aspects, just even trying to look at the construct validity. So the next step obviously would be to try to see if we can use a more dynamic outcome, and Cologne and Emmerich already suggested a few ways in order to use longitudinal data in hospitalized individuals in order to kind of classify this whole resilience process. And what we're going to do is use the indicators in order to try to see if we can predict these different classifications that we have. That is mostly what I wanted to say. I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'll just encourage the chat to ask questions. That was very interesting. Maybe we can sort of start to. Let me just remove your slides. That might be better. Yeah.
Okay.
For me, the most interesting part is of course this distinction that you're making between these two types of variables, and I was wondering whether it is at all the case that there are fluctuations in these variables, like blood pressure, if you would look at the larger time scale. So, for example, I can imagine it could vary, maybe with day and night, or is it the case that it is really constant all the time?
No. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So it is. So in this case, what we're talking about, the caveat is that you're looking at a specific time scale. right?
Right.
Or
Yes.
so effector variables can behave as regulated variables if you look over a long enough period of time, and then also vice versa, right? So it's not a hard and fast rule, because obviously this is a interacting system, right? So at one time scale, constant blood flow might be behaving as a regulated variable, but to something else, maybe on a faster or slower time scale, it might be acting as another variable. So these aren't necessarily hard and fast rules, but in general, if you're looking at a particular time scale, then you can say something about the interrelations. But then even that gets a little bit difficult, because it's not just this pair. Right. It's you know, you're considering these two and how they relate to one another. But, you know, it's not necessarily that those are the only ones that are interacting at that point. So it becomes a bit more, involved.
So because then the heart rate is, of course, that is really a fast varying signal. And the other one was what did you had heart rate and
physical activity was the other one.
Okay.
And that one is also quite difficult to pin down in terms of its I mean, you would assume that it's more of an effective variable in this case, but there are also maybe time scales in which there's more like kind of day night rhythms, and obviously activity where you're not moving as much, obviously, and that would in turn maybe make it a little bit more cyclical or regulated in that fact. But that's one of the things that we struggle with. One of the ways that I thought about trying to do this, I had a student recently working a little bit on this, and that was to use something like a multiscale adaptive analysis. So using something like a singular spectrum analysis, or, you know, like you have these empirical mode decompositions, these types of things, where you can kind of look across multiple time scales and then try to see if there's a difference in the actual mean slopes that you get, or even the mean values that you get across multiple time scales. So, and try to distinguish the resilience groups, for example, in that way. And that'll maybe identify some sort of region of interest on a particular time scale in which the differences between the resilience groups is maximal. And therefore, maybe you can zoom into that particular area and say something about, for this particular population with these criteria for resilience, this is the kind of a time window in which is important in order to distinguish between these two groups. And that's, something that we found. This is also based on work by Fossian. He did it in insomnia patients. Versus healthy controls. And that was really interesting. They showed that there was a kind of a broken scaling relationship at about a 60 to 90 minute cycle. And in that regard, that was related to this kind of rest active cycles, these BRAC cycles. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but you have these kind of normal day night rhythms, and then you have shorter kind of ultradian rhythms to where you're kind of active for an hour and then you rest, and you're
I have those,
yes.
Like,
But what he found is in the insomnia patients, these that particular time frequency of alternations in physical activity was very distinguishing between those insomnia patients and the healthy controls. And so that was very interesting. And we basically wanted to see if we can do something similar with the physical activity that we had from this well-being and resilience study data. And it's very interesting. It wasn't as clean cut because we had people that were hospitalized for a wide variety of reasons. And whereas they just had to kind of, either you had insomnia, you're all right. and that probably insomnia affected probably a very specific region of activity, whereas ours was probably all over the place. And then there was also interventions from the hospital, walking, these types of things that might also influence it. But in general, it looked like there was some separation. We haven't obviously gotten this all written up yet, but it was something else that we thought was kind of maybe helping to resolve that kind of question about the regulated versus effector and what time scale is it acting as what. Still doesn't completely answer the question, but very interesting.
Yeah, so we have some nice comments here about you doing a great talk. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you.
And also a question from James. Was there a reason you chose entropy over other time series quantification measures? Maybe it's also a good idea to talk a little bit about what entropy actually means in a time series, because I think, well, one of the more intuitive perhaps explanations of this, because entropy has so many different meanings also in physics and in information science. But I think if I'm correct, the multiscale entropy is actually calculated as the sample entropy, right? Or on different scales.
Scales. Yeah.
On different time scales. Yeah. So basically what this is you could say a measure of how predictable the time series is. So a white noise time series is not predictable at all, right? So those are random numbers, and then you would expect the entropy to be very high, right?
Yeah.
And then the lower the entropy is basically an indicator of the more predictable the next value in the time series will be. It's a little bit more complex because you're looking at actually patterns, but that's the general idea. Yeah. And then the multiscale addition basically is sort of you're basically coarse graining the time series. So taking like not every value, but then taking two values, taking the mean, I guess.
Average, yeah.
The average, and then for a scale of 4 and 6, and then you sort of create larger bins, and the idea is that you're then looking at different time scales, at slower time scales. Basically, you can't go too faster, of course. Limited by the sample rate.
Yeah, exactly.
And then each time you calculate the entropy, and you see whether there is. I guess the assumption is that if you would be dealing with actual white noise, that you would not see a slope, right? That it would be sort of the same entropy at each scale.
No, it's the other way around. So it's the white noise would start off very high because there's a lot of information at the original scale. Then as you zoom further and further out, there's no more associations because of it's just random noise.
So you get to a kind of so the mean, because it's stationary. If it's stationary white noise, at slower time scales, you get more and more close to the mean.
So you just wound up declining there.
So that's what entropy means for when you're looking at time series, basically, I guess. And so then there are lots of different, just as James notices. Lots of other types of complexity measures. I had one. So I guess the ones that may be most famous are the like the estimates of the fractal dimension, for example, in which you have this field of fractal physiology, in which they figure out that basically the correlational structure in the data is different for the elderly or the young, or especially in heart rate and gait dynamics, those kinds of things.
Those kind of staples.
So why entropy?
It's a good question. There wasn't specifically a reason why we chose that one. Actually, multiscale entropy is quite data hungry in terms of the length that you need, because you could conduct this coarse graining procedure and basically average out a whole bunch of data. So there was no specific reason in terms of practicality that we used multiscale entropy over, for example, detrended fluctuation analysis or these types of things. I mean, with DFA, you would probably run into some issues with the day-night rhythms, for example. So we wanted to be able to use a method that didn't have that issue, even though we wound up using a shorter segment within a day, because for practical prediction reasons, you don't want to have to be able to say something after 2 days of hospitalization. It's not very practical. So we could have went back to detrended fluctuation analysis. Originally, I think so James, to answer your question, originally we went for multiscale entropy because that was something that was used in a lot of the Lou Lipsitz's literature where he was talking about loss of complexity itself. So we wanted to be able to compare what we had in terms of heart rate back to what has been done previously. That's why we also use the original multiscale entropy metric instead of, for example, any of the many flavors of multiscale entropy that have come out actually since. So lots of modifications and refined versions and fuzzy multiscale entropy and like all these kinds of things. So there's plenty to work with, but we went for the original mostly for reasons of comparability, honestly.
I think the original can be found on PhysioNet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice tutorial by Costa. 2005 was the paper. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the web page is also still from that era. I look at it.
Yeah.
But it's it's a very clear description of what they are doing. So I'll put that link in the description later.
Yeah.
Or maybe I can put it in the chat.
Yeah, and I also had the PhysioNet is awesome. I had the MATLAB code for the sample entropy from PhysioNet. So just go ahead, give some credit there. Thank you. That was really nice.
I still have to implement it in R in my R package, but I'll do that soon. Yeah, because I mean it's not very complex analysis. So and it is. I'm now realizing that when you talk about the loss of complexity, right. This means the entropy. Yeah, so the system becomes more predictable. Basically, that's what you, or at least is the series that you're analyzing, right?
Yes.
So that's in this case. Yeah.
I mean, there is a bit of a caveat to this figure that I drew here on this right-hand side. I just want to mention that that there's also Brownian noise, right? And then that would actually go the opposite direction, where there's more and more information as you go along. That will give you a positive slope. And that actually did happen in the heart rate signal at the the faster times scales. But for simplicity, we just, for this particular figure, we just said, okay, if you have for example, the representative physical activity one, where there was, mostly just a negative slope, then you said that, the flatter it was, the more resilient they would appear to be. Now, this isn't hard and fast, of course, in terms of, but more of a rule of thumb.
Yeah, that's so that's then you get into this notion that we talk about a lot, actually, is that you cannot be too much towards, let's say, unpredictability, white noise, but also not in the other direction. That's usually also not a good sign if it comes overly constrained. So you have to be somewhere in between there, and that's
And ideally, you want to oscillate somewhere between those two. There's no real boundary of where, complexity begins and then, randomness and complete periodicity is beginning. So it's very difficult to say. But you can use these kind of rule of thumbs, if you will, in order to say something.
We have, I hope that was a good an answer. But James has another question. So maybe let's just go there. So in your experience, have you only really seen 1/f noise in physiological data? So to explain a little bit when we are talking about, you have to be in between completely random and completely over constrained, let's say, that would be something like a 1/f noise correlational pattern in the data, which is really basically in between those two extremes. So his question is, have you really only seen this? Or would you expect something similar in steps on Fitbit or keystroke behavior on the phone?
Keystroke behavior on the phone.
Well, there is, I think there's a reason why James is asking this, but because he works for a company that is seeking to use that kind of information to get at at health related information, let's say.
Interesting. Okay, nice. Yeah, so James, I think to answer your question, yes and no. So, and I'll maybe elaborate a little bit. So in most of the signals that are easily accessible, so are things like your heart rate or your physical activity from a Fitbit, for example, even steps, these types of things are usually things that are easily accessible from the outside, right? So physiologically, if you just go and you measure things that are easily accessible from the outside or non-invasive, then you would see that these are mostly your effector type variables, right? So things like heart rate and physical activity, these types of things, whereas things like core temperature and, these types of ones that need to be part of this internal milieu that needs to be stable are usually your regulated variables. So if you were to just kind of look at all the different studies that's been done on like center of gravity, these types of things, and you would see on the general trend that these are close to 1F noise because these are the effector type variables that need to do that in order to function optimally. However, I'd imagine that if you were to look at some of these ones that aren't effector, but more so regulated, that you wouldn't see that as much. But it does give a bit of a tilt towards whenever you measure something physiological that you see that it operates as a 1/F noise. So kind of yes and kind of no. Another aspect of that, in my experience, I've been working with time series, physiological time series from older hospitalized adults. So that adds a whole nother level on to what you would expect to see in terms of whether it is true 1/F noise or if there's something that's happened over the aging process or due to the reason why they're in the hospital in the first place that actually disturbs this 1/F. So it'll probably be something that is a little bit off kilter. But generally, the people that are doing better would be closer to that 1/F, whereas the people who are not doing as well probably would be a little bit further away. And yeah, that's not a hard and fast rule, because as in the paper I mentioned, a lot of caveats of these lessons that we learned is that not everybody is at the same part of their actual disease course or their progression. We could catch somebody that's in the middle of the recovery already, or it could be some people that have just had this health stressor, and then those two people could show different levels of 1/F noise. And then obviously, depending on the stressor itself, we have lots of problems with stressor quantification in terms of how much of how can you quantify the impact of a stressor on an individual, right? Because you can have the same stressor to two different people and both of them react a different way based on this kind of intrinsic resilience factor that we're trying to capture in some way. But so there's a lot of moving pieces in order to consider. And so short answer is what you would expect if you were to measure an effector variable. You would expect in a young, healthy individual 1/F noise or something very close to it. In other systems, depends on if it's a regulated type variable, and then also the actual condition. So I'm not really sure how this would translate to keystroke behavior on the phone. I would have to think about that for a little bit. And yeah, but in general, that would be what I've seen. Like not only, I would say, but yeah, it short answer is it depends.
Yeah. Well, no, I think I can sort of agree with that observation. At least that's my experience as well. As far as I know, there have been some experiments, for example, where people are they're called time estimation experiments, where people have to sort of follow a metronome by tapping, right? And then they can either stop the metronome, people have to continue on their own, or those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, they've also done those types of experiments in which they also measured like eye movements and heart rate and also physiological stuff. And they noticed that it is people very easily, for example, can go into this 1/F noise pattern just by tapping, and then the errors they're making, they're sometimes a little bit early, sometimes a little bit late, but that usually neatly follows a 1/f pattern. But the physiological measurements, I think heart rate also was sort of syncing to that. But for example, the pupil dilations or those weren't. So there was also kind of an idea that there might be a difference between. So they focused on what's the two different types of let's say processes. One is under intentional control and the other isn't. So that's where what they were focusing on. But I think your distinction is a little bit clearer or a little bit more accurate here in the two types of variables. So so I think that if we would look in the literature, we would find actually several examples of those differences between processes, let's say. Jingmeng has a question, which is, this is actually the second part of his question. Let's go to the first part. I also found the distinction between two kinds of variables very interesting. Do you think that is related to the difference between point attractors and periodic chaotic attractors?
Yes. There was 2002, shortly after Lou Lipsett's paper came out about this loss of complexity. There was a paper that came out, and I can't remember the name of I think it was something like Vaillancourt. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the name. But they made the distinction between, I believe it was a grip strength task. Similarly, they had a one where you just had to maintain maximal grip strength.
Right. Yeah.
And then the one where they had to do it on a metronome, where you had to increase and decrease the pressure according to something on the screen or a metronome or some timing mechanism. And they found that there was a difference in whether a loss of complexity was indicative of being, because they had a young and an older group that they did this in. And in the there was a difference between whether a loss or an increase in complexity was observed in the young and the old, depending on whether it was a point attractor, meaning this kind of fixed holding the attractor and looking at the pressure fluctuations, versus if they had to try to follow with the metronome. So yes, short answer is I think that looking at the difference between the different types of attractors does influence the relationships that you see in terms of complexity. I'm not so certain about how that affects things like critical slowing down, in terms of variance, for example, or even temporal autocorrelation. I don't think that they looked at that in that particular study. But yes, if I had to guess, there would be also ones depending on the constraints of the task itself that actually influence what you see in terms of the type of variable that you're looking at and how these indicators might change. So yes.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Yeah, and of course, well, it is also a little bit related to what I started out with asking. So if you do not observe the periodicity because you're not observing long enough to see periodicity, then you'll probably either see something that is constant or maybe something similar to what might look like a point attractor, because you're just not seeing the change, and you're just seeing one value of this observable. But I would expect there to be a relation there. So now let's go to the second part. And are there more essential reasons that make some physiological variables regulated while others affected? But well, we have been discussing this. So intuitively, I would say there might be this might be a time scale issue, but perhaps if I if I think about, for example, our paper in which we analyze these, let's say, experience sampling data sets, where they were asking, how are you feeling, but also, are you hungry? Then we found that in those questions about the physiological state, there actually was this was very much like a white noise kind of random process. So there weren't any long scale correlations in there. Whereas in the psychological variables, each variable had like massive like 1/f noise like correlation
Long-range
patterns in
memory.
there.
Yeah.
So yeah, there might be actually a difference there that is more essential indeed. But then again, in my example, you could also explain this by, if you would measure more frequently, you would probably see also a fluctuation in are you feeling hungry, right? So yeah, so I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. So I mean, essential reasons, more essential reasons. Yeah, I think as you mentioned, Fred, I think it is partially or largely a matter of time scale. But then there's also this kind of idea of a control system. So if you, Falcion really takes this kind of idea of control theory, where you have these kind of loops, kind of like a thermostat it's keeping the room at a certain temperature, right? You have the kind of this kind of feedback loop where you have a set point or operating point that you're trying to achieve, and then you have these kind of elements along this loop. And then he really separates out this idea that there are these regulated variables, which are the ones that need to be regulated. And then there's fluctuations or stressors or whatever on the system that actually pops it out, that pushes the system away from that point, and then plays a role. So these physiological kind of responses, which I've also simplified. He also makes a distinction between physiological responses and effector variables, but for our purposes, I simplified it. But there's these physiological responses like increase in respiratory rate and these types of things that might that also play a role in this control loop. And by separating these out, you're able to kind of see what's being pushed and where and why. And in order to be able to say that one is more essential, a more essential reason is because they play these different roles in this homeostatic loop. So I mean, but like we said on the time scale thing, if they're playing different roles in this loop, depending on what size or scale or vantage point you're looking at this control loop, then yeah, it might be that one becomes more regulated, for example, or one. If you zoom in, it becomes more effector-like. So it's just, I think the role that it plays, the homeostatic role is one thing, and then the time scale at which it's playing it is the other. So,
I might also expect that, there could be like, you could sort of expect there to be differences related to whether the system is, the openness of the system. So if you're really dealing with a system that's much more closed, I don't know if such a thing actually exists. But I could imagine, at least in biological systems. I could imagine that there would be reasons that you could think of that made one more regulated. But I'm not sure. It is an interesting question.
It is.
We actually have some follow-up questions. Look, James, thank you. So this very interesting thank you is about your answer, I guess, to his first question. Also building onto Yingweng's question, are there any analyses that can help distinguish? That's
a good question.
Maybe analysis. That's always tricky, but I think you could think of experiments, experimental designs that could actually help you answer that question. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't know if there's any specific analyses that can clearly demark, like say, hey, this is now regulated and this is an effector. Even if you're looking at a specific time scale, I'd imagine that there's a bit of a blend between them. So for example, if you take heart rate and decompose it into its trend, its periodic oscillations, and then white noise, something like a singular value decomposition or something like that, then it would have elements of both in it, right? So there's no real well, I don't know. I haven't thought of a way to clearly demark a regulated versus an effective variable, because the truth is that most variables are playing both roles at some level at some point in time. Usually, I mean, I can't say that as a blanket statement because I haven't tested everything, but but in general, that's what we find. And so in that regard, I don't know if you can definitively say, and I think it would be best to, as Fred said, from either observation or even testing some of these different systems to see, for example, a regulated variable will want to return back to some equilibrium. But then you have to make sure that the actual variable has an equilibrium that you can identify in order to make sure that you can test it as a regulated variable.
Yeah.
So if you can identify it, then you can test it. If you can't identify it, then that doesn't mean that you that it doesn't exist. It just means that you haven't found it. Like you say, you could be looking at it as too small of a time scale or too long of a time scale. And then, that could also be an issue. So you can't continue.
Sometimes it helps. So the second part of his question is also related to this. So sometimes it helps when you're thinking about these things to go to, let's say, the extremes, right? So you could say, for example, the human genome is not changing anymore, and it causes everything about us to be, what we are, right? But if you take that on so you could say, so that must be a regulator, I guess, in this case. But if you take it, if you observe, actually, if you could observe evolutionary timescales, there is fluctuation there, right? So then it would change after sufficient amounts of time, and then it would be very different. It would also would not be a single static variable, let's say. So these things also when you're thinking about the role, for example, of we talked a little bit about insomnia, but the role that quality of sleep plays in depression, for example. It could be the case that a bout of depression starts out with not having high quality sleep, but this will become a feedback loop in which it's almost indistinguishable whether your depression is keeping you from sleeping or vice versa. So, but it might be interesting to think about how you could figure out, and that's sort of in this question also, whether there is an initial causal role for one of these variables that later gets sort of swapped, or maybe gets into this loop that then is responsible for maintaining a particular state. But I think those are questions you will not be able to answer with by running one analysis. But that's something that you would need to experimentally figure out, I think.
I agree.
Well, thank you, James, for your questions. And we have also a question from Andri, which is in several parts. So let's read. Thanks for your captivating presentation. I'm not from your field, and so it's probably a naive question, but you link the complexity with the resilience, the adaptability of the system, and the empirical evidence shows that healthier people have more complex physiological signals. My question goes in another direction. If you detect the improved signals complexity, is it enough to say that the system became more resilient, adaptable?
I'm not sure that you can make those types of conclusions just simply off of the change in the complexity. I'm speaking from more of a medical perspective. I mean, I'm finding out, quite because I have a more of a broader background, but I'm finding out more and more that in a clinical situation, nothing is ever very straightforward. So if you would have caught me a while ago, I would have been like, oh yeah, totally, but now I would be a bit more hesitant. First off, to the first part of your question, you talked about this adaptability. And I think I would say that adaptability is a major part of this kind of resilience aspect that we're looking at. But if you remember earlier, I said that this is actually not only the actual response, but also the recovery, right? So you have this kind of resistance to the challenge, and then you have this kind of process where you're actually returning back to those to the baseline levels, or this kind of pre-stressor functional capacity. So it's not just about being adaptable that makes you resilient. It's also about also being stable, right? So being able to return back to that initial functional level. So what I would suggest is that you look at multiple indicators, not just the increase in complexity, but also see if the regulated variables are showing decreases in their temporal autocorrelation or variance or cross correlation between subsystems, and then compare that to this increase or decrease in this signal complexity and other, maybe a regulated variable system from the same person, in order to say something about the overall improvement in resilience or not. And this goes towards something that we're really trying to focus on in terms of resilience monitoring in geriatric wards, where you can say that we have all of these different tools, right, that we have, and we want to be able to say, okay, if we were to just take these vital signs from these people, we would be able to say something about their overall resilience. And if that is something that we can track over time, we can say, okay, this person is actually getting better, or this person is actually getting worse and we need to pay attention. So it's more of a long-term process that you can take repeated measures of this over time in order to say something about resilience monitoring, I think. And that's something that I think is brought up by the question that you have here. So it's not enough to say that the system became more resilient / adaptable, I think, but it does go towards that. Right. So maybe it's necessary. Maybe, I don't know if it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. I'll at least say that.
Yeah. So I do see a lot of similarities to sort of the direction that people in psychology are thinking about psychopathology, for example. That the idea is that it pays off to look at these more global system properties, let's say, or characteristics like resilience, which is a kind of very high level idea about, it could be the heart rate, but it could be something else. But the thing is, if you find indications that somewhere something is not going right, that immediately has consequences for the entire system. So you're probably moving towards more a system level description, basically, of what health might be, and not focusing on the specific specific aspects of the components of the system, basically, which is I guess what you could call classical medicine, or I don't know. Maybe it's still contemporary medicine that does that. I don't know. But so I do see that trend also in clinical psychology, psychopathology studies. So, so in the end, what always, if you're also thinking about how to run experiments, based from this perspective, you always need to have some kind of reference for each individual, basically, for what is variability for this person, right? And what is stability for this person? Because there's so many individual differences there. But
that's definitely one of the things.
But the cool thing is that a lot of these techniques, also these measures like entropy, they require you to interpret them relative to some kind of basic level, basically, and so they're very suited to do these kinds of things. Okay, thank you, Andre. There is James is on a roll. James is on a roll with questions.
I'm glad you're interested.
Yes, sure. In your institute, are complexity measures being used? Oh yeah, that's an interesting question. Monitor patients day to day, or is it still in the research phase? If it's being used, how do you experience pushback to change, if at all?
Hmm.
Well, you are at a very special department where everybody is into complexity.
Yeah, everybody's into resilience in the geriatrics department. However, So in our department specifically, the well-being and resilience study was a one-off kind of thing right now. It hasn't led to a full-scale implementation of these devices being used to monitor them. However, I am also working on another project where they have been using another device that has been integrated into actual care in the general ward. And this is, I don't know if you're familiar with the Visi mobile device, Fred. It's like it measures a bunch of different physiological signals, including continuous non-invasive blood pressure. So you get like kind of regulated variables.
Oh yeah,
So this is something that's already in like process, and actually they're thinking about expanding the operation to cover more beds with these devices. So this is something that the continuous vital sign monitoring is something that is already being implemented. However, the complexity aspect of it, using this time series data in order to make decisions basically on resilience and actual affecting practice, is not there yet. And that's something that we're actually actively in the process of trying to do. So that is something that is promising in order to see how we can actually turn these different indicators into actual like feedback and to use this in managing care. But as of right now, it's partially in the research phase in terms of how we can actually use these indicators validly. And it's particularly in the case of older adults or, COVID or any of these different types of situations. And that is mainly what this paper that I presented today was trying to kind of get at, or at least show you where we are along this path in order to get there, basically. So, yeah. And
maybe I can sort of build a little bit of a bridge to come to kind of a closure here, because I skipped the news, and one of my news items was actually talking about this summer school that's coming up, where we will be presenting some things. But this is being organized by a group of let's say institutes that are for mental health in Austria and in Germany. Sadly, it will be online, so we will not be in this beautiful environment. But what is interesting about these institutions is that they actually do use the they don't monitor physiological time series, but they monitor every day like psychological variables. And they do make use of complexity measures also to make clinical decisions and make decisions in intervention strategies and those kinds of things. And so that's very interesting. And they it will be held as a virtual conference. Do I also have the program? Yeah, I will. We will also be speaking there. I will be speaking. Marlijn will be there, and Jingmeng also, yes.
Nice.
But as you can see, what they they are basically coming from practice. But if you would not know this, you would think that these are a bunch of mathematicians, self-organization and networks, linear and nonlinear approaches, and they have now constructed a phase transition detection algorithm.
Oh wow! Nice.
Yeah, so they are very much into thinking about how you can actually apply these complexity metrics and techniques in practice, and I will actually be telling something about machine learning. So that's interesting. I don't know if it's still open, but might be interesting for listeners here to have a look there. And then so we usually end with our segment about the strange attractors. So let's just keep doing this. right, so here we are.
Nice.
We briefly discussed something, so I looked up our little page. So maybe you can wait a minute. Let me share the screen a little bit, because we are, of course, at the same institute, at the same university, but you especially are involved in RICH, the Radboud Interfaculty Complexity Hub.
Yes. So yes, this is a interfaculty initiative. It's been supported by the Radboud University, and we are basically. I'm the coordinator of RICH, so the Radboud Interfaculty Complexity Hub, RICH for short, and I am basically in the process of trying to try to get this thing. Get the collaboration between individuals that are largely scattered across the Radboud University here in Nijmegen, in the Netherlands, and who are all using different types of methodologies and concepts and different aspects of complexity science. Together, basically. And this has been something that was initiated before I got here, but I've kind of taken over a little bit in order to be able to try to take it to the next level in terms of trying to put together different collaborations between these individuals so we can better understand what each one of us is doing. So some of the activities that we have are monthly RICH meetings where we present someone from varying faculties, management, philosophy, behavioral sciences for EFRED. These are all different people that we hear from on a monthly basis. And we have also two major aims that this RICH monthly meeting plus other resources support. And that's the development of joint master thesis projects. So these are ways for low bar to collaboration, basically, where we have people from at least two faculties, maybe more, who get together and jointly supervise two or more students on a complexity related project. And this kind of forces us to really understand what's going on with the other faculty and what they mean when they say certain things about complexity. And so this is something that we've been trying to put together in terms of different faculty members and connecting individuals. We have a Slack workspace where you can go in and there's a very informal kind of chat where you can post things and interact with other people. So if you're interested in that, there's there. We actually do have a new web page, by the way. But it's kind of in development.
Oh, okay.
Well, no. So we have one for the university, and then we also Andrea, one of the managerial assistants, has been putting together a nice new one. It's kind of independent or standalone, would still link back to this one. But that's still in process.
To change the content.
So I mean, it's a bit more flexible. So we're still working on that. But for now, this is also this is where we are, but it also lists, as Fred has here, some potential projects that you can get involved in. And we also, in addition to the different master's projects, we also have the aim to develop a bachelor minor that's available across the university-wide for any student who's interested, in order to basically get a basic education in complexity, what that is, and hopefully change their perspective on research and as they move forward. So this is something that I would definitely make a shameless plug for. And so if you're interested, obviously you can visit. I think Fred, you've already put the link to this particular website.
I put it in and so look, Andrea is also listening. So yes, a new website is coming soon. Okay,
stay tuned. Awesome. Yes.
We will definitely promote it here. So I think this is a great initiative with lots of potential. Also, to attract perhaps students from around the world if they are interested in these kinds of things. I mean, we're not probably not there yet, but I do envision that this could become very interesting, also for people outside of our university, at least attract some good students.
Yeah.
And we have some projects that are now starting. Starting next year. So very exciting, and we'll probably report about them here as well.
Yeah.
So I think we're pretty much we've been talking for 1 hour and 20 minutes, so that's a good a good episode length.
Nice.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Very interesting. Well, maybe we can invite you again in a year or so and see whether you have been able to develop some kind of analysis
Yeah,
that will
of
piece
course.
apart those variables.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. And so for people, we have not planned a next episode yet. So if you are interested in content like this, please subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon so you get notified when we are posting new content. We will probably take a short break during the summer. But before actually the summer vacation, we are thinking about doing something a little bit different, which is more like a discussion episode in which we have several people talking about a particular topic. And this will probably be the information theory about individuality, about basically the science of the individual based on information theory. But we're still thinking about how to organize that. So subscribe. And of course, if you like the content, you can also press this little like button. That's actually a good feedback for us. So again, thank you. And well, we'll hope to have you again as a guest.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Fred. I appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.